A very good afternoon to our esteemed guest who would be addressing us today, and to everyone joining us for the fourth session of the National E-Conference on Contemporary Trends in Literature. It is my honor to welcome our first speaker, Professor Madhusmita Pati, to this session. Her list of achievements is long, so I'll just mention the highlights. She is the Dean of the School of Languages and Professor of English at the Ramadevi Women's University in Bhubaneswar. She got her PhD from Utkal University, Odisha. She was awarded the Fulbright Fellowship for Pre-Doctoral Research in the year 1998-99 for pursuing her doctoral dissertation entitled Photographing Proteus, Patterns of National Character in Four Great American Autobiographies at Purdue University, Indiana, USA. Her area of research is American autobiography, Indian women autobiography, and diaspora writers of the United States. She has published in Indian as well as American journals of repute. Her latest book, Literature and the Art of Communication, has been published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. Today, her topic is Dalitism and Gender through the lenses of select Dalit women autobiographies. With that, I hand over the proceedings to Professor Madhusmita Pati. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Safi. And at the very outset, I would tell you all that it is indeed a privilege for me to be a part of this national level e-conference, which is being organized by your esteemed university. I would like to first thank the Vice Chancellor, Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Dr. Ranjit Verma, the convener of this conference, who is the head of the Department of English, Dr. B.C. Pandey, and all the organizing committee members, especially Anindya, who was with me in the Department of English, Ravensa University, for a short sprint. And just Atanu introduced himself as one of the participants of the Refresher course in Sambalpur University. I am happy to see him here. And and the moderator Safidani, thank you again for introducing me to the this very gathering. And as Dani has talked about the topic, I would repeat it that it is Dalitism and gender. And I'll be talking about Dalitism in general first and then moving on to talk about the gender issues through selected women autobiographies. While tracing the origin of Hinduism, Sasi Tharoor, in his book Why I Am a Hindu, this book came out in 2018, he points out that Hinduism embraces an eclectic range of doctrines and practices from pantheism to agnosticism, from faith to reincarnation to belief in caste system. But this diversity problematizes the political space of each and every Hindu. The frame of reference of my talk here is based on the fact that the dialectics of subalternity is a geocultural condition where, where the Dalit conditions remained dominated and, and was used at the hands of the upper class. Dalit and Dalitism, broadly speaking, is a political term which symbolizes the relatively new identity of a group of people who were earlier known as untouchables. In spite of its legal abolition, untouchability continues to be practiced in different forms and degrees. The rise of Dalit movements and Dalit literature is an example of how Dalits have become a new political community. Through their writings and activities, they have been speaking to power. Here, I would like to mention or refer to a book by S.M. Michael, who, in the introduction to the book which came out in 1999, that is Dalits in Modern India Vision and Values, he points out that the untouchables or the Achuts were renamed as Harijans. We know Harijan is a very glorified epithet first coined by Narsimha Mehta and later popularized by Mahatma Gandhi. Exterior caste. This was a coinage by J.H. Hutton. Depressed class was a coinage by the British people and it was used by the British officials. Outcast, parias. Again, paria is it refers to para or paria, which means a drum in Tamil. And in that same book, Michael reinstates the older names of the untouchables, the Mlecha, the Chandala. The Chandala name has been used by Manu in Manusmriti. Panchama, which means the fifth class. Avarna, which means
Excuse me,
outside the
ma'am.
four varnas.
Ma'am, can
Yes.
I interrupt you for a second? Uh,
Huh?
the volume from your end is a little low. Can you just see if the connection of your earphones is firm with the laptop, and
Okay.
the
Just a
microphone
second.
is close to
Uh-huh.
your mouth? And also, please, if you can check the volume, perhaps
Volume is low. Hello.
it's still a
Am I
little
audible
low.
now?
You are audible, but the volume is low.
Uh, then should I connect it to the Bluetooth? No.
Okay, I think we'll just have to work with that.
Hello, hello. I'll try to be louder then.
Sure, ma'am. Sure,
Hello.
that should work.
Is
That
it
should
still?
work fine. Please go
Huh?
ahead.
Okay. Were you able to hear, or should I start from the beginning?
We
Do you
can
want
we
me to
can
start
hear
from the
you. It's
beginning?
just that the volume is a little low. If you can hold the mic close to your face, perhaps that might.
Yes, this will
Yeah.
help. This is better. This is
Let's
better.
let's hope it works better.
It works better.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay. Please go ahead,
let
ma'am.
me continue then.
Sorry for the interruption.
Uh, no. So I was referring to S.M. Michael's book, Dalit in Modern India, Vision and Values, which points out about the Achuts, the Harijans, the exterior caste, the depressed class, the outcast, the parias, and Mlecha, Chandala, Avarna, Nishada, Polakasha, uh, Antayaja, Atishudra. These are all derogatory terms in order to signify the untouchables as downtrodden or polluted by caste. Going by the available source, it can be said that the term Dalit came to be used in public discourse towards the end of the 19th century. Mahatma Jyotirao Phule who is one of the pioneers of the non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra, is supposedly the first one to use the term Dalit to describe the condition of the outcasts and untouchables as oppressed and exploited people who are maltreated by the upper caste. Phule deliberately used this term, which was there already in colloquial Marathi, but he initiated it into the public discourse against the menace of Brahminism throughout the 19th century. Later, B.R. Ambedkar used the term particularly in Marathi speeches and occasionally in his Marathi writings. He considered Phule, Lord Buddha, and Kabir as his guru. Ambedkar provided the intellectual basis for the formation of Dalit identity. He organized Dalit activists, political societies, and institutions in the process of forming Dalit identity who assumed a definite identity. Among the dominant struggles over the years were conservative caste for separate electorates for Dalits and emphasized that Dalit identity is different from that of the Hindus. He even asked the Dalits to have their dwellings away from the Hindu society. As the chairman of the drafting committee and also the first law minister, Ambedkar contributed immeasurably to the socio-cultural assertion of Dalit identity. With the embracing of Buddhism with many of his followers, um, and in proclaiming Buddhism as the alternative to irrational Hinduism, Ambedkar established the constitutional identity. Now, coming to talk about women, Jyotibai Phule's contribution is remarkable, and Jyotibai Phule's women liberation movement inspired Ambedkar. It was in addition to Hindu reformist programs of widow remarriages, annihilation of sati system, he concentrated on education and rights for women. He struggled hard. Ambedkar struggled hard to liberate women from the age-old slavery and to create a share in all spheres of life. When we come to Brahmo Samaj and Arya Samaj, they kept women, somehow kept the women in dark. Ambedkar opened up new horizons of freedom and equality for women. Instead of proposing reformations for women, Ambedkar put forward total liberation for women. His relentless fight for bringing out revolutionary changes in the social and economic life of women in the form of introducing the Hindu Code Bill is very important. Now, regarding marriage, divorce, succession of parental properties, he's the one who said like women should have equal share. And the Dalit movement from 1980s onwards aimed at fighting for Dalit asserting themselves. The Dalits challenge the very foundation of Indian society and polity, the very foundation on which Indian society and polity is based. And this was mainly because of the influence of Mahatma Phule and Baba Saheb. Taking the lead from Ambedkar's theoretical basis, taking the lead from Ambedkar's theoretical basis or of Dalit identity, literary writers and activities began to narrate the Dalit experiences, and as a consequence, they brought awareness among the Dalit. The concerns of the writers include the concerns of the Dalit writers include denial of access to resources, participation in political processes, exclusion from social institutions, construction of Dalit identity, demanding equal share in resource, among others. Their writings aim are all aimed at building an awareness. So since 1980s, we see in the lot of writings by Dalit writers, but all of them have a single aim, that is building an awareness. And next is all of them are autobiographical in nature because they talk out of their experience, and what they narrate is their experiential reality. Now, with the rise of the Dalit movement, Dalit started becoming the speaking subject, and we witnessed an explosive arrival of modern Dalit voice on the Indian literary world scenario. After the radical resistance of Dalit Panther in the 1970s, we know the Dalit Panther movement was not only a movement for the liberation of Dalits, but it also propelled Dalits to, or it brought forth, encouraged many Dalit writers to write about write about themselves, to come out with Dalit literature. And initially, during the Dalit Panther movement, Dalit writers were writing poetry, but another genre started taking place of poetry, and that is autobiography. So now, autobiography is a genre which many Dalit writers have turned to, and today it is it is an emerging power of discourse. Wherever you go, like you go to the bookstores, you go to Amazon, you go to Flipkart, you'll get plethora of books by the men and women. Now, while going through the books, you will kind of see a difference. You will witness a difference. Whereas men life narratives have of we see that they often appear to be ego-driven and individualistic, linear progression to political awakening. Women writings have been relational. Women writings are more community based. They are politically and purposefully diffuse. Now coming to I'll give you some statistics. This statistics is taken from the book Ala Irudayam and other two writers, Jayashree and Joel, who have they have edited the book. The name of the book is Dalit Women Speak Out Caste and Gender Violence in India. He gives the statistics that today the number of Dalit women is around 80.517 million, which is approximately 40%, 48% of total Dalit population, 16% of total women population, and 8% of total Indian population. So the statistics gives us an idea that Dalit women really um, form a major chunk of our nation's population. But despite these statistics, the representation of these women and their writings is marginal and are hardly visible in women reformative movement. But then we can discuss women reformation in India. When we come to talk about women reformation in India, we can divide it into two historical phases: the pre-independence and post-independence. The pre-independent women's reformative movement advocated widow remarriages and was against the practice of child marriages, and it was basically confined to the upper caste. This movement excluded the Dalit and the Sudra women. Even Dalit men were excluded. The post-independence feminist movement has which is led by the educated women, they have been silent on Dalit women's subordination by the upper caste and upper class. So modern feminist movement in India, so I can say, is not is when we look at it, we are not they're not talking about or they're not against the oppressive structure of power, and it did not question the tenets laid by Manu, Kautilya, Vatsyana, the founders of Indian patriarchy. The modern feminist movement doesn't question this. The former two, that is Manu, and if you look at the works of Manu and Kautilya, we see that both of them envisioned the subordinated status to women and evolved the forms of punishing the subversive women. Vatsyana considered women as mere sex objects, amounting to commodification of women, foreseeing the cultural capital, like we can say, he had somehow foreseen the cultural capitalism in the 20th century. The three of them denied social and political rights to women. In contrast to Manu, Kautilya, Vatsyana, we see that we have Lord Buddha, who preached for equality of women in all spheres. And here I will make a reference to Kancha Ilaya's work. Buddha, according to Kancha Ilaya, can be credited with five significant achievements. Number one is recognition of political right of women to join the Sangha. Number two, forcing the Sangha to recognize women's right to be leaders.
Uh,
Number three,
ma'am,
allow. Yes,
ma'am, if I can interrupt you one more time, I'm really sorry about this.
yes.
But even though we can hear you very clearly, apparently those of our participants who are watching this on social media platforms, they are unable to hear you clearly because of volume issues. If I could, if you could just check if there is anything that is loose at your end, perhaps your headphone isn't connected properly, or if you could use another pair of headphones or anything else at your end, if you could just
Hello.
see.
Now can
Yeah,
you hear me?
in fact,
Can you
in
hear me
fact, yes,
without I'm without the earphone?
yes. Without headphones, I think we are hearing you better. Just give me a moment.
Can you ask the participants? Can you ask the participants whether they are able to hear me or not?
Yes, I'll just do that. I'll just do
Hello?
that, ma'am. Just
Hello?
yes, yes, ma'am. Just we are asking the participants if they can hear you more clearly without the headphones. Just give us a second.
It's not working. Participants are not able.
Ma'am, could you just say something, a line or two, just
Hello?
to.
Yeah, this is Madhusmita. I'm talking about Dalitism and gender. Okay. So I'm
I would
audible,
just
right?
ask. Okay, good. Then let us do
Then
this without
I'll
the
continue
headphones.
without the earphone. Okay, let me
Yes, ma'am.
continue
Yes,
without the
yes.
headphone then.
Thank you
Now,
very
as
much, ma'am.
I was talking about the influence of Manu, Kautilya, and Vatsyayana, who were considered to be the founders of Indian patriarchy. The former two envisioned the subordinated status of women, I reiterate, and they evolved different forms of punishing the subversive women. Vatsyana considered the women as a mere sex objects, which amounting to commodification of women. The three of them denied social and political rights to women. In contrast to the status of mainstream women, Lord Buddha preached for the equality of women in all spheres. Buddha, according to Kancha Ilaya, I have actually referred to the work of Kancha Ilaya. He has credited Buddha for five significant achievements. Number one is the recognition of the political right of women to join the Sangha. Number two, forcing the Sangha to recognize women's right to be leaders, allowing women to develop their personality and individuality independent of any male support, breaking the myth of family and importance of producing male children to attain salvation. Number five, recognition of the need for women's education and political initiative. Now, continuing Buddha's tradition of gender equality, the Bhakti saints, the mystics of the Bhakti movement, fought against the Hindu orthodox practices. Their attempts at the liberation of women may be considered as a cultural revolt. Though the mystics hail from different social backgrounds, their social agenda had been against the Brahminical male hegemony. However, the mystics broadened their agenda and questioned all form of social subordination, emphasizing on spiritual equality and social justice, and they were equally concerned with gender inequality. Therefore, they protested against the subordination of women. An interesting aspect of the mystics movement from gender equality, for gender equality, had been that the women took active part in mystic activities along with their men. The best example here is of Mirabai, a Rajasthani Rajput princess known for her hymns in Hindi, who became a disciple of Ravidas, an untouchable saint. Accepting a guru from Dalit background by a Rajput princess was a kind of rebellion against, not kind of, it was a rebellion against against casteism and patriarchy of the medieval period. The women mystics used to assert themselves when they were not treated on par with men mystics. This aspect probably is unimaginable even in contemporary situation we are today. The philosophy of Lord Buddha and the movement led by the mystics influenced Mahatma Jyotibai Phule and Ambedkar, Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Both of them, Baba Sahib Ambedkar and Mahatma Phule, they are considered to be the architects of gender politics in India. Now, both of them are considered as the ideological and political founder of the socio gender equality. And what Ambedkar probably foresaw was Michael Foucault's idea or theory on knowledge power equation. I'm not emphasizing on that, but that we talked about knowledge power equation. I'm not emphasizing on what Foucault had said, but I'll go on to Baba Sahib. Fulle knew that exclusion of women from knowledge was the main cause of women's subordination. He considered education as a vital means of women's liberation. Now, I'll come to the contemporary times. Contemporary times means coming to we witness a new awareness and a very and two very significant factors have come up, which has led to the new awareness. Number one was participation of upper caste women in the protest against implementation of Mandal Commission's proposal to extend reservation of OBCs. Here I'm referring to Sarmila Rege's work, Writing Caste, Writing Gender, narrating Dalit women's testimonials, where Rege has given an elaborate picture of, of the anti-Mandal violence. He points out that one important challenge to the scholarship on caste system came in the form of post-Mandal violence by the Savarna elite students. It posed a direct challenge to the assumption that caste identities in urban India were personal and private matters. Thus, in the politics of power, the worst traps are Dalit women. Like if we keep Mandal Commission in mind, worst traps are the Dalit women, and they became we can talk about they have been treated as mere symbols of sex and means of reproduction upon which multifaceted violence could be inflicted. Now, Ambedkar comes to a very close, he comes close to the person of seeing caste as a marriage circle which regulates access to resources as well as exchange of services based on territoriality and kinship. However, he does not go into an analysis of how the closing into endogamous marriage circle is related to patriarchal controls over women. So, what he's putting forth is that he's emphatically talking or telling us or projecting to the other Dalit women that the axis of caste, class, and gender play the most important role in politicizing the socio-cultural realities of the extent of operation of Dalit women. Having said that, I'll move. Having talked about Phule, having talked about Ambedkar, having talked about their stance on Dalit women and their contributions, which has really given Dalit, not only Dalit an identity, but Dalit women a separate identity. I'll now move on to literature. Dalit literature, we can say, has been subjected to obliteration. Why I say this is that we all know, students of literature, we have referred at some point or the other to Susie Tharu's and Lalita's twin volumes of women writing in India. Though a radical critic of patriarchy, we cannot say that it represents Dalit women or Dalit women writings. The anthologies mostly focus on the writings of upper caste women before the late 19th century. The editors might not be might not have considered caste as a criterion for selections in that anthology, and in this sense that the anthologies suffer a limitation. The dual literary space, however, is now being filled up by Dalit anthologizers. For example, there's a book, there's an anthology which is titled as Nalla Podu, which is an anthology that retrieved Dalit women writing in Telugu and similar. If we have or if similar attempts are made in other languages to have anthologies of Dalit writing, probably we will come out with a rich Dalit women literature from the early periods. Now, what we can talk about is only of the modern period. In the modern period, literacy, social awareness, political awakening, and identity movements resulted in a spurt of writing. I reiterate that point. The English publication of Dalit writing is governed by the market abroad. The political correctness on the part of the translators, editors, publishers, and the elite academia made it possible that a large body of Dalit women writing is published in English, and the same has become a part. The translated Dalit women writings have become a part of highbrow academics. Here I would like to mention a few contemporary Dalit women writers. They are like Urmila Pawar, Jyoti Lanjewar, Hira Bansode, Surekha Bhagat, Pradanya Lokhande, Meena Gajbir, Baby Kamble, Santabai Kamble. They are all from Maharashtra. We have Gogu Shamala, Jupaka Subhadra, Jajula Gauri, M.M. Vinodini, Chalpali Swaruparani. They have all written in Telugu. And then from Tamil Nadu, we have Sivakami, Bama, and Virama. These are all acclaimed women autobiographies which have been translated. But the most acclaimed autobiography is, if a name, there are two, the three, like Bama's Karaku, which was published in 2004, Virama's Bama's Karaku came out in 1994, sorry. And Virama Josen Rasin's work, Virama, Life of a Dalit. It was published in 1997 in Tamil. Urmila Pawar, The Weave of My Life, was published in 2009, and Baby Kamle's The Prison We Broke in 2008. So these publications and many more in publishers' pipeline in next few years, sup- supported by sound theory. Um, mm, if we look at it, if it is supported by sound theory, it will challenge the elite feminism and and will also give a direction to Dalit feminism. Now here it is. I again Dalit feminism has already come a long way and has already achieved milestones in the process. We see the intersection of caste, class, and gender have become the axis for reading the text written by these women. Now, this change that is taking place can be perceived in a way they have defined their identities, the way they have perceived their agency, and the way they have created the social reality. Now, from looking at themselves as Dalit women who were identified with the communities, they have now arrived a point in which they have arrived at a point where they do not want to be addressed as Dalit women, but as neo Buddhist with multifaceted identities. The changing nature of their feminist consciousness is well articulated in their writing. Now, when we are talking about Dalit feminist consciousness, we can I would like to take a clue from Maya Pandit, who talks about three phases of Dalit feminist consciousness, and three generations of Dalit women writers. The first generation of Dalit women writers include Dalit women like Baby Kamble, Santabai Dani, Santabai Kamble. These three women, they were direct followers of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and they took active participant and they took active participation in his movement. They had assimilated his message. That is, Baba Sahib's message was educate and agitate. Baby Kamble and Dani, they were actively involved in Ambedkarite agitational politics, whereas Santabai Kamble had made education as her field for active intervention. They were keenly aware of the amalgamated structures of caste and patriarchy that built up hierarchies among laborers along with along the caste and gender axis. So this is the hallmark of their political consciousness. In Baby Kamble's words, the was Dalit movement represented the struggle for truth. Now that Baba Sahib had initiated. Now, what is this truth for them? The truth represented the memories of hunger and food, humiliation and degradation, labor practices and cultural traditions of their communities, and and these truths they valorized and denounced respectively. The most significant aspect was their indomitable spirit, which took pride in their being Dalit Mahar women, and which protested strongly against Hindu religious doctrine and caste oppression. Their portrayal of the graded patriarchy among Dalit communities reflected a very rare and humane maturity. They did not denounce their men, but tried to explain the violence directed at them as as the only outlet available to their men suffering under the yoke of caste oppression. Significantly, they were markedly different from their male counterparts, both in perception of gendered inequalities and as a sense of and also a sense of agency. So they were different from their male counterparts. The way they looked, the way they perceived the gender inequalities, and also the way they saw themselves as agencies for change. Now coming to the next part of it, like no, before I go to the next generation, I would like to mention certain male Dalit writers like Daya Power, Lakshman Gaikwad of the same period, like before 1980s. But they saw when we read their autobiographies, they hardly ever saw their women as agencies of socio-political transformation. Unlike Unlike these men, These women, the three women I mentioned, explored their community culture in a more nuanced and sensitive manner. They explored the myths. They discussed the superstitions and lived practices against which Baba Sahib had asked them to rebel. Here I would like to mention a very interesting fact that in Baby Kamble, in her autobiography, explores the myth or talks about the myth of Tulsi Vivah in the Brahminical culture as against the subaltern culture. The practice, the myth of Tulsi Vivah, Brahminical culture versus the subaltern culture is a case in point here. So it brought out a very different cultural history. Uh, Now I go to the second generation of Dalit women writers. They arrived in the scene in the 1980s, and by that time, the society had changed significantly. Urbanization and industrialization had brought out the ugly face of a fractured modernity. The rural landscape was witnessing the disastrous impact of green revolution that had forced thousands of landless laborers, mostly Dalits, to migrate to the cities in search of work. And yet, conversion to Buddhism had given them a rare confidence. The most significant writers of this period were Professor Kumud Paude, who was a Sanskrit scholar, Jyoti Langevas, he was a poet, and Urmila Power, who was a creative writer, and whose autobiography, Aidan, which has been translated into English as The Weeds of My Life, Aidan has won accolades, and as it represented the strong sense of political and cultural identity as educated middle class Dalit women. Their experiential works had expanded. The language was vibrant, and they were the voices with which they resisted was very strong. So they were quite different from Baby Kamble, from Santabai Kamble. But here, these women were very different. But here, only Urmila Power has written on autobiography, and the way she has written about she is not representing herself the way Baby Kamble does. Baby Kamble focuses more on the impact of Ambedkar on her life and the activist responsibilities that she took up because of responsibility, because of the influence of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. We do not witness that in Aidan or Weave of My Life, but the voice is very modern, and we see power as a very intense individual, and she is very audacious, and I would say very deliberately audacious. And Urmila Power has also challenged the Varna system and proposed a critic of patriarchal ideologies and practices in their own communities as well as in the society around them. They were strongly feminist. These three writers that I have talked about, they were strongly feminist, and in that they were distinctly different from men. Not only that's not only distinction, but at the same time they were very different from. They were quite different from the upper class and the upper caste women in the feminist movement. Now, how were they different? Like the upper caste feminist movement demanded reforms in rape laws and in family institutions, and they included these demands in their political agenda. But they did not see that caste, they did not see caste as one of the foundational principles of social structures that generated that violence. This is where Dalit women's consciousness registered a strong protest. They provided alternative perceptions of the construction of Dalit women identities in post-independence era, where the nexus of caste and patriarchy dominated. Now, coming to Urmila Power's Adan brought a keen perception of how the new modernity has transformed and kind of intensified their gendered and caste oppression. She writes, caste is hidden like a prowling beast in the forest. She said, it can pounce any time on you. This is what she writes in her autobiography. So the histories that the writers of the second generation of Dalit feminists that I have mentioned, the histories they created or construct, they proclaim the difference from the predecessors, male Dalit writers as well as contemporary feminist positions look, located in they were all located in the urban centers like Aurangabad, Nagpur, Mumbai. But they exposed how caste and patriarchy were not frozen in time, but actively operated in a deadlier form in contemporary society. They, however, shared the Savarna feminist assumptions about sexual politics that played out in the arena of the family, marriage, and social institutions. The way they began to challenge the dominant notions of female sexuality invited the wrath of many within and outside the Dalit movement. Now, coming to the third generation, that was during and after 1990s, one witnesses proliferation of female voices speaking from diverse locations and communities. Prior to that, the first generation, second generation were somehow localized in Maharashtra. But here, after 1990s, we see Dalit women speaking from diverse locations and communities. One major ideological and political change is that they do not call themselves Dalit anymore. They call themselves, after the conversion, most of them are converted, they call themselves as Neo Buddhist or Ambedkarites. After conversion, the term Dalit becomes a misnomer. Now, this identity is a distinct political assertion of being equal or even better than the mainstream citizen. The voice of contemporary Ambedkar women, like the contemporary like Pradanya Pawar, Chaya Gaonkar, Shilpa Kamble is quite different. They refuse to be confined to the culture of narrow identity politics. That is, I don't mean to say that they do not engage in patriarchy, caste issues, and modernity, but what for them, sexuality is a major field of engagement. And we also see a strong awareness uh, of the changing scenario, and it is because of globalization and how it has further intensified both class and caste divides. They expose the limits of identity politics of Dalit organization, uh, which for them appear to be sinking into the mire of religious dogmatism. And this religious dogmatism is what the Dalits had objected. But now it seems to be sinking back to that, and that is what these women are rejecting. Through their writing, they offer a close scrutiny to the changing forms of patriarchal reorganization in the contemporary society, and and this is what and this is what it entails for any women, both in private and public space. And also, what we get is a strong sense of women's agency building up. Now, coming to, I'll skip a bit because I think I'm taking time, but I'll come to two important Dalit autobiographies written in Hindi. One is Dohra Abhisap, which is written by Kaushalya Baisantri. She is a pioneering feminist voice in Hindu Dalit spheres. She writes her life, and she writes in Dohra Abhisap, my son, brother, and husband may be all angry with me, but I too should have the freedom to tell my own story to the world. After such an unequivocal expression of her personal right to tell her own story, her introduction continues to be a clear articulation of the social and feminist imperatives. Basantri announces a purposeful framework of her own autobiography, a strategic desire to open society's eyes and to speak for women who were scared into silence. The other book is by Sushila Thakbhaure, and it is Sikanje Ka Dard, that is the pain of the trap, translated into English. The whole autobiography was serialized in a magazine later. She also writes about the negative reaction of her family members upon reading her manuscript. He writes, sometimes they would get angry and sometimes I would. Many so-called well-wishers told me that I should not write so much about family matters, but I wrote about them anyway. I want to tell the whole truth. My autobiography is not just a Dalit autobiography, but it is the autobiography of a women. Having talked about these two women autobiography written in Hindi, I would move towards the South. Influence of Ambedkar is felt in all states, uh, but besides Ambedkar, Periyar also had a strong influence in South India. When it comes to discussing the caste, class, gender vulnerability, we and also to the and also when we have to discuss the unique identities formed because of this access and because of the lived experiences, Bama's autobiography Karakku comes to the mind first. He does not mention about Ambedkar or Periyar, and we all only can perceive it very subtly, perceive the influence very subtly. The autobiography testifies the disquietude of the worldly affairs that often compels individual to seek refuge in religion and spirituality. Bama belonged to the Pariah community, compromising mostly Christian converts. But what is significant here is that very often the Pariah community was defined as Dalit Christians. Though her community people embrace Christianity to annihilate the caste biases, Bama is not able to escape from the practices of untouchability in the convent or in the church. That is what is very striking about this autobiography. Now coming to like, but like Kamble, baby Kamble, she gathers courage to resist against the caste tyrannies and assert their identity as a Dalit Christian who could survive on her own terms, working as a teacher for the downtrodden, spreading light of education among the ignorant. I'm not going to. I would like to now. I'm just skipping a few autobiographies which I thought I would mention, like Sivakami. I'll discuss a little about a more recent autobiography which came out in 2017. That is Sujata Gidla's "And Among Elephants," an untouchable family and the making of modern India. It's a very recent publication. Gidla is a Dalit writer of, we can call her, she belongs to the generation next. She portrays another face of caste discrimination. And also, we see a different vision in her work. She is a native of Andhra Pradesh. She pursued post graduation at REC Warangal. She followed her education in IIT Madras. She was a research and associate in the Department of Applied Physics, and she also worked on the project funded by ISRO. But then she moved to US at the age of 26 with her parents and worked as a conductor in New York. And that is, while working as a conductor, she voiced the evils of caste discrimination from the global cosmopolitan perspective. Gidla, Gidla's life confirms to the pertaining impact of untouchability, which although is no more practiced directly, but its residual impact is still persistent in various forms of our society. Shifting the caste perspective to the foreign location, Gidla points out that Americans understand racism as far as color diversities are concerned. But the matters relating to discrimination by birth is not so much is not emphasized. They assume caste as a personal issue that won't be visible from the exterior to the person, unlike color. Hence, it is can easily be concealed. That is how that is how thinks and rethinks about the rhetorics of caste working in as a canvas conductor there. So caste for people who are not in India is something that really does not one can conceal it. But with the use of the metaphor that is of ants among the plodding elephants is suggestive of the low impact that the Dalits are capable of creating on others. The name of the book is Ant Among Elephants. Um, so this is he's talking ants. This is using a metaphoric image here, where Dalits are like ants who will hardly ever have any impact on others, even if they are equally educated and are affluent like the upper caste. So this new women that I have been talking about, the new women writers that I have been talking about, have changed the map of subaltern women writings through their ideological positions and literary contestation. They have been targeted by many, by the critics of Dalit patriarchy as Western. But what is uh, what is more important is here I would like to refer to Uma Chakravarti, who has contended that caste and gender have been pursued as two separate systems of stratification in the sociological scholarship on India until their link was made salient and turned into an object of inquiry in the period following Mandal agitation. As the debate on caste intensified, Dalit feminism forced feminist scholars to reflect on multi-layered form. And this is where how I'm going to conclude. Dalit, it is like Dalit, if you look at upon retrospection of what I have talked till now, I have tried to present a Dalit women autobiography as a perfect quintessence of a subaltern self who, through multidimensional drawbacks, can extract inner strength in order to reclaim their identity. Uh, Triply subjugated through caste, class, and gender, these women seem to have be rising out of metamorphic phenomenon. But then uh, the point comes, many the sociologists and anthropologists working in this area. Especially, I would like to mention Margaret, who in 2000 in her book, in her anthology, tells Dalit women to speak for themselves. If you do not speak for yourself, she writes, I would like to quote what she has written in her 2005 book. I am a Dalit, middle class, university educated, Telugu speaking, Dalit Christian women. All these identities have a role in the way I perceive myself and the worlds I inhabit. I, as a Dalit woman, primarily write for Dalit women to uphold our interests. This statement of mine is necessary because if we do not define ourselves for ourselves, we will be defined by others for their use and to our detriment. This voice is not representative of all Dalit women. However, I know that my voice is important because it is the voice of a socially denigrated category, suppressed and silent. So this uh, I picked up this section from Margaret Stewart, and what is very important over here is that she is telling everybody to realize the fact that Dalit women identities are for the Dalit women to define. If they don't do that, it will be their own loss. So their lives and leadership as the Dalit women cannot and should not be controlled by the boundaries set by the oppressor, who may in some cases look like an ally or a friend, but then it proves detrimental to Dalit women identity as a whole. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. I think I took a little long
Uh,
time. It's okay.
that's that's perfectly all right. I think we're all quite mesmerized with that talk. I mean, I am literally out of words for how to describe what we have just heard from you. It was a magisterial survey of Dalit writing uh, from a historical perspective, from the perspective of gender, and the nuances between different castes, and the nuances between
Yes.
women
Uh, Thank you. On India, can we have some questions? Ma'am, we have questions
That's nothing.
on your screen. Please answer. On the screen, we have a question. Is there any
Yes. Can we
specific
please
difference
use
between the
some?
term Dalit and subaltern? Can we use both for someone who is oppressed, or Dalit comes under the genre of subaltern? That's a question. Ma'am, please answer.
Uh, so answer is like there is both. We should not use it as a continuous, as in not interchangeable. But when we talk about of mine, we talk about Dalits as somebody belonging to outside the Avarna or
Anindya, put Safe off screen so that he can reconnect himself.
Now can you see me? I think you
Yeah,
can. Okay.
yeah.
So did I answer that question of Ashutosh?
Anindya, put
Ashutosh?
another question.
Yeah, put up. I am
Yeah,
ready.
yeah, yeah. Another question is, ma'am, do you think that only high-class Dalit women have an agency to voice their issues? Because in reality, most of the economically deprived Dalit women are still unrepresented. This is a question by Pradeep
See, as
Dhillon.
I told you this, okay. What I say, yeah, they were. That is what I had been talking about. That high caste women, they are representing their whatever they are fighting for. They are representing their voices more strongly. But there has been a change after 1980s. That is, now we see there are a lot of people who are working in this area. There are a lot of sociologists who are picking up oral narratives from Dalit women, and they are coming forward to it. Now they are no more the other. Like, all the mainstream is trying to include them in the mainstream. They're writing, especially in the mainstream. So we cannot say that they are no more able to voice themselves. If they are no more able to voice themselves, probably we would not have had so many works. I was referring only to the autobiographies, but then I referred to the poets also. I referred to novels also, novelist also. Like Paude has written novels, and there are other works which I had, but I skipped because I don't know why I crossed time limit. But they are voicing themselves, not only autobiographies but other forms of writing also. But then there is one aspect which I had emphasized is we have anthologies, one by Sasi Tharu and Susi Tharu and Lalita, and the other that is Nallu Podu, that is Nallu Podu. So if anthologies come up, then maybe we will have more and more of voices to hear. Next question.
We have a question from Mohammed Ghaus. What are the constitutional rights to uplift the Dalit women in Indian society? Or shall the government frame new provisions for the welfare of Dalit women, like right education? Please explain. This is a question by Mohammed Ghaus.
Actually, right to education is already there. Uh, what are the constitutional rights to uplift the Dalit women? Now, Dalit, we have for Dalits we have the reservation policy, but we do not have anything separate for Dalit women as it goes. We have different movements. For example, I'll tell you about. I skipped that section, but I had it in my mind that the Dalit what there are certain groups. There are um, certain groups, like, for example, Dalit Mahila Sangatan, the National Federation of Dalit Women. The National Federation for Dalit Women was founded in 1993 by Ruth Manorama. Dalit Mahila Sangathan, which was founded by Maharashtra Dalit women. They are fighting for the recognition of uh, Dalit women's question, both at national and international levels. So no, that is all I can tell you at this point of time. That there are bodies which are talking about Dalit women's rights, and they have there are lots of NGOs who are with government support. They are working on.
Ma'am, let's take this question. How would you compare the subordination of Dalits with that of Black Americans? Can both groups draw parallels in the problems they face as communities and look at each other for solidarity? Dalits
when it
versus
comes
Black
to
Americans.
Dalit women and black women, African American, or we won't call it black, we can call it African American women, the levels of subjugation that I talked about, that there are there are triple layers of subjugation. Dalit women are suffer because number one, they are born as a women. Number two, they are subjected to all to a lot of oppression and subjugation by their own men, that is Dalit men, and then they are subjected to the upper caste men and women, subjugation by upper caste men and women. I need not emphasize on the fact that we have the upper caste men and women uh, have always they have always made okay, now I'll move to, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Sir, I'm audible.
Yes,
Now
yes.
coming to African American women, we see the same triple subjugation by men, as a women they suffer in the hands of their own men, and they suffer in the hands of white men as well as white women. So
Uh,
we can see a parallel between their experiences.
on India, as our next speaker is ready, we are not going to take many questions. I think this should be the last question. The question is by Tushar Baneka. There is always a debate about representation of Dalits by non-Dalit writers. Do you think only Dalit writers should justify the socio-cultural political representation, especially in biographies?
In one word, yes. It's only Dalit writers who it's the experiential reality that they are projecting. So when we have something, when we take up something as Dalit writing, it should be out of the experience of a Dalit writer. So yes.
Yes, Safe, now please introduce Dr. Jacob and let us proceed to the next speaker, next session. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nedika Jacob. His doctoral thesis from Rutgers University, USA was entitled Looking Through Words, Histories of the Visual Image in 19th Century Literature. And he teaches literature in Ramjas College, Delhi University. He is not a fan of lengthy introductions, so I'll stop there and hand it over to him. Welcome, Dr. Jacob.
Thank you so much, Shafi. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on new formalism. Am I audible and am I clear? Is that okay? Before I begin, I just want to check if I'm audible. Can you hear me, Shafi?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. I can hear you clearly, Jacob.
Okay, thank you.
We can all hear you, yes.
So please let me know if there's any problem with the audio. Okay, so let me begin with a couple of clarifications. One is that there are two things that go by the name of new formalism. One is a somewhat contemporary movement among American poets, which is known as new formalism, and they believe in a return to meter and rhyme over various modes of free verse that are practiced in American poetry today. And so they've been advocating a sort of return. I'm not going to be speaking about that particular form of new formalism. What I'm going to look at is a particular literary critical trend and orientation, and it's therefore only to the literary critical tradition of new formalism that I'm going to speak, but not to the American movement among poets who, like I said, talk about meter and rhyme. So new formalism, and I'm just going to give you a little introduction to what I'm going to say, is I should clarify is not like a program or a school of criticism that has its own manifesto and works as if it has a kind of clear set of goals. Instead, it is more in the nature of a kind of loose grouping of critics who have a kind of common orientation towards how they deal with the text. And one way of understanding new formalism is to see it as a reaction to a mode of criticism that is, for a long time now, for the last 20, 30 years perhaps, has tended to ignore the formal and linguistic nature of literary text and instead reduce the text to its representational or mimetic elements. Right? So what I'm really saying here is that there is a tendency to ignore the text as text and focus more on the various elements that are represented within it in terms of themes, in terms of different social groupings that are represented in the novel, and so on and so forth. Marjorie Levinson, who is a very important figure in the new formalist kind of pantheon, wrote a very important essay in PMLA in 2003 called "What is New Formalism?" And one of the dominant tendencies that she is critical of in contemporary literary criticism is what she calls a tendency to offer or consider literature as offering us bundles of historical and cultural content. And this, she says, has transformed literature into a kind of socio-historical study. This content is identified and is simplistically mimetic in the sense that it is subjected to various kinds of critique coming from a range of ideological positions, post-colonial, feminist, race theory, eco-critical, etc. I mean, I needn't give examples because a lot of contemporary criticism primarily belongs to labels such as these, and the task they perform is very often to mine the text for representations of race, gender, caste, and so on and so forth, which are, of course, very important work. But I'm going to suggest that they fall short in one very crucial respect. New formalism, let me clarify, is not in principle opposed to ideologically or politically motivated critiques of literature, but only to the tendency of any critical project that refuses to see the text as a text, and instead, it refuses to see the text as a formal and linguistic artifact, and instead merely looks through text rather than looking at a text in order to reveal a variety of ideological fault lines. Again, let me stress that the problem that new formalism has with such readings is not with the political orientation of these critical positions, but rather with any reading that reduces the literary text to a direct symptom of culture, or considers the text as transparently providing access to cultural biases and assumptions, or more broadly, is focused on an idea of social content, that it sees literature as sort of unproblematically reflecting to the reader. Right? So to at this point, let me give you a small example of one critical project that tries to break away from this, and this is only by way of a minor digression, which will kind of clarify the point I'm making here. Frances Ferguson, a very well-known American critic, has a wonderful reading of Jane Austen's Emma, where she shows that the narrative technique of free indirect discourse, which is a very important innovation that Austen is credited with, allows us to read the whole marriage plot and the usual feminist readings of the marriage plot from a somewhat different perspective. So for Frances Ferguson, if you read the text against the insights that we get through the free indirect discourse style, which is basically a a collapse between the narrator's voice and the consciousness of the character, so that we really don't know whether it is the character's voice that we're hearing or the authority of the narrator whom we are listening to. There's a kind of slippage between these two. Ferguson shows that if you read Emma from the point of view of what free indirect discourse allows, you actually get a very different sense of the question of marriage and the role of women's agency within marriage, because you see that there's a discontinuity between the figure of Emma and the larger communitarian plot of marriage and the larger group, kind of social norms that dictate how marriage should be conducted. So you see a kind of dissonance between the character and this larger ideological idea of marriage and its salutary effects on women. But Ferguson's point is that this is only visible and only intelligible as a idea if you were to read the novel primarily from its narrative lens. If you read it as text, if you close read the novel in order to hear this free indirect discourse working in a certain way. So that's just my short digression to show you how paying close attention to language, according to Ferguson, allows you a more nuanced understanding of the political, as opposed to merely seeing the text as a representation of dominant views about gender and marriage. Right? Literary criticism, to speak more generally, is a discipline that more than any other has devoted a lot of time and has over the years developed a vocabulary to describe the fact that how something is said has a bearing on what is meant by it. Literary studies has historically prided itself on this disciplinary feature, namely its attentiveness to the relationship between form and content. And it has a complex critical terminology to analyze individual texts in terms of the operations of genre, language, rhythm, figures of speech, sound effects, narrative sequencing, etc. So in other words, we have a very evolved and sophisticated terminology to look at how language works. And this focus on how something is said, as and when that focus becomes the dominant focus, and it becomes kind of hardened or ossified into a mode of analysis that is or tends to bracket out history, politics, culture, ideology. As and when that happens, we call such readings a formalist reading. Right? So just to define formalist readings for you, formalist reading is obsessed with questions of form at the expense of history and context. Right? So the ability to bracket out all that is outside the text and focus only on form tends to be what we now refer somewhat disparagingly to as formalist criticism. Right? Conversely, and to flip it around, an avoidance of the question of form completely results in a reduction of literary analysis to a sort of simplistic socio-historical analysis that is largely indifferent to the fact that every text is what Derek Attridge calls a singular inhabitation of form. That every text kind of inhabits form, but does so in extremely unique and irreducibly singular ways. I will elaborate this idea of singular inhabitation of form, which is a phrase from Derek Attridge, in the course of my paper. So, new formalist criticism, to try now to kind of give it more concrete sense, attempts to inhabit the text from inside and not merely approach the text from the outside, and believes, therefore, that a mere application of concepts like gender, class, race, or caste, or disability from the outside does both a disservice to literature and to the idea of a progressive political orientation. So it is therefore in favor of a more meaningful political engagement that new formalism insists that we inhabit the text from inside, which really means that we consider the critic's job as one that involves a very close and rigorous encounter with the text. New formalism believes that the informational value and social content that literary texts embody is, to be sure, an important part of any critical study, but such content is not transparently available to us, but instead needs to emerge through a painstaking and patient encounter with the text. Doing so enables us to understand how literary texts make or process social content, not just mirror them or occupy predetermined ideological positions. I was in two minds whether to demonstrate this through a reading, but I realized that reading, in order to be effective, would have to be a long one, and that would pretty much take up all the time I have to speak. So I'm therefore going to only very cursorily refer to certain texts and readings, but I will not take up any single text and focus on it in some detail. So now to try and therefore consolidate what I'm saying in relation to what new formalism is distancing itself from. On the one hand, like I said, it is distancing itself from a kind of ideological critique of a very simple kind, which refuses to engage with the literary as literary. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is also in some ways trying to reformulate its relationship with old formalism, if I could coin a new phrase. Where, by old formalism, I mean a whole bunch of different formalist approaches to texts, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But it's that relationship between new formalism and old formalism is an important one, which is that it's not merely a kind of break from what it sees as over and done with, which is a kind of narrow formalist tradition that it is breaking off from in order to reinvent itself as something new and cool. But instead, new formalism is a kind of re-articulation of many of what lies buried within new criticism and is often forgotten within new criticism. So it is, in some senses, a kind of tries to establish a continuity with new criticism, even as it, in some senses, offers a break from that earlier generation of formalist critics. So let me just unpack what I mean by old formalism. They consisted of about 4 different categories. Right? One is what is known as the Chicago school of Aristotelian formalist criticism. That is, it followed a certain notion of rules and unities that compose the text. And the most well-known figures of this phase of formalist criticism were R.S. Crane. I don't know if I'm sure an older generation like myself would know these names pretty well, because these were the staple of much of what we studied, say, about 30 years ago. So the Chicago school consisted of critics like R.S. Crane and Wayne C. Booth, who wrote this wonderful book called The Rhetoric of Fiction. So, and that offers one block of formalism, which is distinct from other blocks, and I'll tell you what those other blocks are. The other well-known strain of formalist criticism is what we now call Russian formalism, and there were a number of important figures there, and I won't have time to go into it, but there were different schools of Russian formalism. One was a whole school that was organized in and around the question of language and linguistics, and that was known as the Roman Jakobson school. And then there was a bunch of literary critics who applied formalist methods to literary criticism in order to make criticism have a more scientific basis, and try to identify the literary text as an object that can be studied through certain objective means of analysis. And the well-known figures here, for those who need reminding, are Boris Tomaszewski, Eichenbaum. Eichenbaum is a well-known Russian formalist who has a very important essay which we read at the MA level and in Delhi University, where he tries to map formalism in relation to some of the other dominant literary trends in Russia. And then you also have figures like Vladimir Prop and so on who compose this particular strain of formalism called Russian formalism. Then we have what is the more familiar variety of formalism, which is known as New Criticism. And New Criticism comprises a number of well-known names, and there are many histories of New Criticism written now. But most histories would credit the story of New Criticism to be pretty long. It perhaps goes back to T.S. Eliot and his focus on a reading of texts, which is something that wasn't done with the same kind of rigor that he would bring to it. He was also an influential figure for a number of critics like I. Richards and so on, whom I'll talk about. But Eliot was also well known for his theory of depersonalization, where his emphasis on the text as the focus of study, rather than bringing in the life and the biographical information of the author, became a staple of a lot of new critical kind of rules or norms. The other important figures in New Criticism, which I'm sure many of us know, I. Richards was the first generation of these new critical stalwarts. His Principles of Literary Criticism was a very path-breaking book, and many second-generation new critics were influenced by I. Richards. Then we had figures like Alan Tate, Cleanne Brooks, whom all of us know, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with Cleanne Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn, and figures like John Crow Ransom, William Wimsatt, and Monroe Beardsley. Wimsatt and Beardsley wrote a very important essay called The Intentional Fallacy, followed by another essay called The Affective Fallacy, both trying to show that the author's intentions are not to be taken into account when in the study of a text, and in the affective fallacy, it tried to rule out the subjective reactions produced in readers as a valid point of entry into the study of literature. So John Crow Ransom is also an important figure, and his 1941 essay called The New Criticism, perhaps the source of the name New Criticism, was a very kind of canonical essay, which actually laid down a few basic principles of New Criticism. And I'll mention some of them in a minute, but let me also mention Murray Krieger, who is also an important new critic, whose book called Ekphrasis, The Natural Illusion of the Sign, is a book that I've used a great deal in my own doctoral work. So John Crow Ransom wrote this essay called New Criticism, and one of the interesting parts of that essay is a set of 6 exclusions. He says that any new critical project must start on the premise that it excludes from its domain of analysis the following 6 items. One is what he calls personal registrations, which means all readerly effects, subjective responses, impressionistic accounts of how you felt when you read. All of these are, for him, not valid material for the new critic. Second, he excludes what he calls synopsis and paraphrase. And we all know that Cleanne Brooks wrote this wonderful essay called The Heresy of Paraphrase, where in Ransom's case, his point was that no summary or alternate account of the text would suffice in place of the text itself, because all that a new critic had as fair game for analysis was the text as its primary focus, and no other account of the text would be an acceptable point of entry into the text. Number 3, he excludes what he calls historical studies. And this is a very wide range because it includes biography, all literary background, uh, any bibliographical connections, citations of other literary originals. He says that all of these, which are, these are all perhaps more appropriate for what he calls comparative literature. But he said for Ransom, such historical material that are extraneous to the text must be kept out of the text. Fourth, he finds linguistic studies, that is any sort of philological or linguistic analysis that looks into the etymology of words and looks at the history of certain terms or phrases. He says that these are all at some level not the focus of what a new critic should be looking at. Number 5, he excludes moral studies, and this is an interesting point because it suggests that no moral framework can be imported into the study of literature. That any moral framework that is seen to emerge from the text would be acceptable, but no moral framework that is kind of extraneous to the text can be parachuted or brought into the text from outside. And finally, he says, number 6, any special studies, by which he means any abstract or prose content taken from out of the work, which includes for him things like Chaucer's relationship to medieval science, Spencer's view of the Irish question, Shakespeare's understanding of the law, Milton's geography, Hardy's place names. These are all his. I'm reading from John Co. Ransom's essay. He says all of these are off limits for the new critic, primarily because these seem to be what he calls special studies. That is, areas of interest that are not mandated from within the text, but merely brought to the text as an extraneous consideration against which the text is then measured. So for the new critic, there are these sorts of things which need to be bracketed out before new critical work can commence. And new critical work, as we all know, is largely a focus on a close encounter with the text through careful and very attentive reading of the text in terms of its paradoxes, in terms of its internal tensions, in terms of irony, and all of this is seen to be the primary subjects that a new critic deals with, to try and orchestrate them and see whether these tensions are able to get resolved at the level of form, right? And whether there is some way in which these internal contradictions within the text, which are orchestrated by the text itself, do they find some sort of resolution? This is a very narrow reading, perhaps, of new criticism, and I'm going to show you why this is perhaps a narrow reading. But it is certainly the case that new criticism inaugurates a certain kind of bracketing. It says that there are some things that are to be kept outside the scope of critical work. And by this systematic exclusion of a number of things that I just read out, it certainly seems to provide the grounds for a lot of new and perhaps what we find in contemporary criticism, a lot of reservations about the politics of such exclusion. That what is at stake in excluding history, biography, other social questions? What do we lose, or rather, what do we gain if we merely kind of focus on the text as a kind of fetishized entity, which is to be seen in a kind of fundamental disconnect with all that is outside it. Now, this is an uncharitable reading of new criticism, and I should clarify this, because a lot of new criticism and the better varieties of it are not really arguing for an exclusion of all these 6 items, but and this is an important point to kind of keep in mind as I progress, that rather than excluding history, culture, politics, all that the new critic is saying, and this is the more charitable reading, is that if you want to talk about history or culture or politics, look for these from within the internal resources of the text. Do not import them from the outside. History is entirely valid if history figures within the text. So, in other words, the focus is really on letting the text speak rather than bringing to the text a whole set of concerns that are considered, like I said, extrapolations or a kind of bringing in of foreign elements into what is a kind of a kind of integrally formed unit of meaning, which is a text. Right? Now, let me now just say a couple of things before I move on to what I'm really keen to talk about, which is that there are a number of continuities between old formalism and new formalism. One of the most important continuities is perhaps the important role of close reading that even today forms a very important part of what we do, both as teachers and as researchers. A lot of what we call close reading is a legacy that has come to us from this sort of new critical tradition. And what new criticism has kind of bequeathed us is the now almost staple of much criticism, that things have to be demonstrated through a textual reading. That is, you can't merely make assertions about a text, but at some level you have to allow the text to offer some evidence for the claims you make. That's not what close reading exactly is, but I'm suggesting that things like the examination questions that we still have today, where you have a passage or a few lines from a poem, and we ask the student to draw out the links between that little fragment and the larger text. That idea of the part as being in some way symptomatic of the whole is a very new critical idea. It comes from new criticism, that parts and wholes are in a very organic way linked and therefore can't be seen as separate. And therefore, this whole RTC, reference to context model that we often use is still very much inherited from this sort of tradition, where we look at the fragment of the text as some way significant and able to speak to the larger text in terms of a whole. So there are therefore these continuing legacies of old formalism, primarily given to us by new criticism, and a lot of new formalists like Marjorie Levinson, like Susan Wolfson, or Frederick Vogel. These are new formalists who would be willing to acknowledge that there is a certain kind of consistency between the positions of some new critics and what they themselves consider themselves as doing. But at the same time, there is also a sense of a break, some sense of a re-articulation of what new criticism stood for. So new formalism is also going to show you some levels at which it kind of claims for itself a whole new identity. So the rest of my paper is devoted to looking at one very, very central idea in new formalism, which has been the subject of many, many essays around the question that I'm going to take up now. And new formalism, let me clarify, has produced quite a few books now. There are many book-length studies of new formalism, including some very kind of seminal essays on new formalism in a number of important journals like Modern Literary Quarterly and ELH, and of course PMLA and so on. So there are some, by now there is also already a kind of formidable set of critics and positions taken by these critics that now, like I said, can be called this grouping, rather loose grouping, called New Formalism. Right? But one very, very central question that a number of these New Formalist critics can take up is the question of form. What does form mean? So I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation in considering some of the larger debates around this question of form and how New Formalism is an attempt to rethink the question of literary form. And I'm going to leave you at the end of this presentation with some thoughts on whether or not this is worthy to be considered a break or merely a kind of reiteration of some of new critical orthodoxies in terms of what form means. But let me just give you a little kind of introduction to this idea of literary form, which is at the best of times is a somewhat nebulous term, because we often find it difficult to put our finger on what does form mean. And one way of telling the story of form is, of course, to go back to Plato for perhaps the most well-known theory of forms. And in Plato, as we all know, forms represent a certain kind of essential, eternal, unchanging realm of forms, which is distinguished from the transitory and ephemeral world of changing appearances. And for Plato, forms were abstracted from material reality, but at the same time, although forms represents a kind of ideal realm, forms can only be known through its instances. Form can only be known through its instances in matter. Right? So every object in the world allows me to imagine the ideal version of that object in this somewhat metaphysical idea of pure forms. Right? Form, because of this duality between something that is ideal but at the same time depends on material instantiations. Form, because of this duality, being outside history at the same time made evident in history, is a somewhat slippery category. Form is a slippery category, and in some ways represents the limits of our own thinking, because, like I said, there's a fundamental fuzziness about where does form reside. Does it reside at this end of the spectrum, closer to material reality, or is it a purely ideal concept that has very little to do or is indifferent to material reality? There are a number of synonyms for form which are in circulation today. Form is seen as synonymous with shape, design, structure, frame, outline, ideal, genre. For instance, you think of the sonnet as the sonnet form as being the formal unit within which you can see a number of literary instances of the sonnet form, or format, another synonym for form, or template, or body, and the list goes on. The form can be interchangeable with a number of such items. Form is always an unfinished term because it can only be made visible through its instantiations, like I just said. Form is an empty and meaningless abstraction without something through which it is embodied. So it's only in its embodiment that one can sense this presence of something that is outside the embodiment. It lives on the basis of a contradiction, since it is both body and spirit, and the spirit that animates bodies. Let me just explain this a little bit. In Descartes, there is what is famously known as Cartesian dualism between mind and body. There is a sense in which the mind is this immaterial, an immortal thing, as compared to the body, which is a material object that is finite and will die one day. So this kind of dualism leaves us at the cusp of a certain kind of contradiction, which I'll try and explain. Because one could also see the body as that which gives form or shape to spirit. What I mean by that is there are two possible readings of form here. One is, if you think of something like genre. Now, like I said in the sonnet, a kind of abstract set of rules that define the sonnet represents the idea of form, and this is clearly a purely normative or an abstract idea, which gets, like I said, illustrated through particular sonnets, which then demonstrate what the sonnet is in its particularity. In that sense, the form is the abstract thing, and the sonnet is the instance of it. But if you look at the body-soul question, it is possible to turn it around and say that the body is that which shapes and gives form to the soul. That a soul can only live within a certain form called the body. So you can already see that the word form has a certain plasticity to it, which can move between levels of this kind. And now let me come to another very important moment in the history of form, and this is Immanuel Kant's third critique, which is known as the Critique of Judgment. And I'll take only a few minutes here. In Kant, the aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful is on account of our contemplation of the form of the object. For Kant, it is this sort of the foundation of our capacity to understand beauty is our recognition of form. Judgments of beauty are on account of a pure perception of form. But here again, there is a tension between the universality of such aesthetic judgments and the irreducible particularity of the object which occasions the judgment. So to give an example, Kant comes up with the argument that my experience of beauty is an extremely singular, private experience of beauty. It has to be something that I experience at the level of self. But that private experience of beauty, the moment I say that something is beautiful, at the same time I also make a universal claim. I'm not saying that this is beautiful for me alone, but that I'm saying that every human being must find this beautiful. So all judgments of beauty are universal judgments. So now this is a kind of tension because you can see that tension in the way Kant formulates this problem, for which he uses a kind of oxymoron called subjective universality. And subjective universality therefore represents the sort of tension between that which I must feel at the level of my own subjectivity, but I see as having universal value, and it's a universal claim that I make. This results in Kant's reluctance to offer any examples of the beautiful, because a pleasure in pure forms must always avoid its capture in concrete embodiments or instances. So Kant says that he tries to shy away from giving us any particular examples, because for Kant, beauty is not something that is there in an object outside, but it is in our contemplation of the object that we experience or are able to make a claim about beauty or pass a judgment about beauty. But at the same time, Kant's problem is that to give a particular example is to make it seem as if this thing is beautiful and therefore can be mechanically repeated, and all such, like if a rose is beautiful, then therefore all roses are beautiful, would render beauty into a mechanical and somewhat formulaic thing. So for Kant, it is only forms that are beautiful, not particular things, and he therefore fights shy of actually giving us any particular instances of beauty. All he says are that the closest he comes to, by way of examples, are flowers, free designs, lines aimlessly intertwined, signifying nothing. You can see there's a kind of nebulousness or a fuzziness about being able to describe what pure form means, because pure form, like I said, is always at the cusp between something that is impossibly abstract and at the same time irreducibly particular. And so it lives in the gap between these two. Form in this sense, is always that which kind of occupies the gap between an abstraction and an embodiment. Or in Angela Layton's beautiful formulation. Angela Layton has a wonderful book called On Form, which is a book I would highly recommend for anyone interested in questions of form. And for Angela Layton, form is something that, and I quote, that pivots, P-I-V-O-T, pivots between the world and mind. It's exactly at that hinge between the world and mind. Following Kant, Romantic aesthetic theory conceived form in precisely this dual sense, once again best expressed in somewhat interesting formulations like organic form, or in Schiller's phrase, living form. Now, organic form and living form is a bringing together of something that is live and kind of coupling that with the idea of form. So form is distinctly something that is not a kind of empty abstraction here in Romantic theory, but is something that has to be alive and a kind of organically conceived concept, not something that can be seen as merely a kind of abstraction. Form was, in Romantic theory, no longer a noun naming something, but it becomes a verb that is more in the nature of a shaping force, which makes it an agent rather than a body. And again, once again, to come back to Kant, he says that the difference between a wristwatch and a tree is that a wristwatch is made up of parts that are mechanically put together, but are in no way organically related to each other. The parts are brought together mechanically and work together, but they do not, in a fundamental sense, belong to each other. As opposed to a tree, which is a better example of this sort of natural form or organic form or living form, where all the parts are in some senses organically linked to each other. Each part emerges out of another part and forms a whole, and the whole is always more than the sum of its parts in terms of organic form. So there's a sense in which organic form is seen as a kind of live principle of movement, as opposed to the dead abstractions of a more kind of purely metaphysical idea of form as an empty ideal. Form becomes for the Romantics that mysterious presence that serves as the creative principle organizing and conjoining matter and mind in ways that are outside the poet's volition or voluntary control. And I won't go into this, but there's so many instances of Romantic poetry, Wordsworth and so on, where it is this mysterious presence that brings together things in the poet's mind, showing and making possible for, in the poet a certain understanding of that organic of that organic whole that nature occasionally gives glimpses of. This notion of form for the Romantics is consciously contrasted to the idea of form as a mechanically imposed set of norms and rules that was seen as central to neoclassical aesthetics. Now, Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Diaries, for instance, makes this distinction between how an artificial set of rules are in many ways antithetical to the spirit of poetry, and that what would make for real poetry is this capacity of the poet to produce organic form. His characterization of neoclassical aesthetics is, of course, a subject of some debate. And let me just take a few seconds to say that any movement, literary or literary critical, tends to establish itself in relation to something else. And when that happens, there is always a tendency to flatten the other against which you define your own newness. In that sense, I do think that, as a number of 18th century scholars would say, that this characterization of neoclassical aesthetics as being prescriptive and rule-bound is perhaps a kind of caricature. And anyone who knows Pope and Pope's poetry well enough knows that this is not strictly speaking true. But nevertheless, for the Romantics, when form becomes an imposition, or assumes a prescriptive status, that marks the death of art, or its condition of because it becomes into something that is a frozen kind of artificial stasis, or kind of mummified art, right? So for the Romantics, nothing could be further from the spirit of real poetry than this sort of artificially produced stasis that is the result of form understood in prescriptive ways. The idea of form as an animating principle, or even a kinetic energy, that makes the work of art into a restless and mobile thing, as opposed to the work of art as a motionless, timeless, and mute thing that is arrested into frozen permanence. Now, this tension between form as an animating principle, as opposed to the artwork as a timeless and frozen, and what I call a mummified, embalmed art, is demonstrated in a number of Romantic poems, and I needn't go into details, but just to take a few seconds more, it is Keats's Grecian Urn is a great example of this distinction between an art form that is mute and seemingly permanent or frozen, as opposed to poetry, which seems to be capable of a certain dynamism, a certain movement that the cold world of marble sculpture seems to be lacking. Right? There are a number of examples of this sort of antithetical understandings of form as both as a mobile and live thing, as opposed to form as arrested and fixed or frozen. And both Victorian poetry and modernist literature carry on this sort of dialectic between movement and stasis. There are lots of examples of this. Just to take the names of a few, in Tennyson's Lady of Shalott, there is a sense in which the castle of the Lady of Shalott is marked as the point of a kind of unchanging stasis, against which you see the dynamism of the town of Camelot. And the poem is really staging the encounter between stasis and movement. Similarly, in Browning's well-known My Last Duchess, you can see that there is a tension between the mute, silent portrait of the Duchess, as opposed to the extremely loquacious and verbal sort of gymnastics of the Duke, who tries very hard to counter the influence of the still and silent object, which is the Duchess and her face. In modernist literature, there are again many instances of this dialectic between stasis and movement. And just to name one, in a lot of representations of interiority in modernist writings, especially in the case of Virginia Woolf, you see that there is a tension between the constantly dynamic nature of consciousness, as opposed to the literary means of representing that dynamism, which is always a sort of tension, because it is very easy to think of literature as a kind of stilling or a arresting of the movement that is perpetually unfixed in terms of a consciousness that carries on unchecked and refusing to follow any linear patterns. Right? So this is a very foundational tension in a lot of literature between this idea of some things that tend to fix and arrest, as opposed to things that tend to push and allow movement. Right? Form is that thing which lives in the crack between the death-like quality of fixed form and the animating principle of living form. Right? And it's precisely in that little gap that you find that form seems to work. Roland Barthes, in a book called Responsibility of Forms, writes that, and I quote, "Form is what is between the thing and its name. Form is what delays the name." Form for Barthes is that which mediates and also animates the space between the thing in itself, which in Kant is something that is unknowable. We can never really know the thing outside our own mental grammar. And on the other hand, the word, which is of course dead and mechanical. So it is between the word and the thing in itself that thing called form mediates, or kind of it interrupts that relationship between the thing in itself and the word. Walter Benjamin, in an amazing essay called "On Language as Such and the Language of Men," makes a similar point, but a very powerfully conveyed point about the difference between the divine and creative energy in language to be able to name things, which he says in its most pure form is the divine idea of calling things into being through speaking the word. This creative aspect, he says, is still available in the idea of naming someone, because in naming someone, you are literally constituting a subject. You are creating the possibility of subjected through the naming. So in that sense, naming has a very constitutive function. It literally creates the self, creates meaning, and so on. But on the other hand, Benjamin alerts us also to the possibility of language after the fall. In a post-Lapsarian world, he says language becomes a fallen thing. It becomes merely a system of classification, a tool of knowledge, of knowing the world. And in such cases, he says, mechanical naming merely fixes objects into a system of knowledge, thereby imposing a silence on the thing. Our classificatory systems that deny the irreducible and singular identities of things are examples of this sort of imposition of language to still and arrest the multiplicity of the world or the sensations produced by it. So for Benjamin, there is a danger of this sort of language in its more arid and dead form, which is merely a form of labeling things and runs the risk of what he calls over-naming, a tendency to give a name to everything, which he says is fundamentally antithetical to the richness that resides in things, which is to merely impose a name on a thing is to render it, according to him, mute. The thing goes mute in the presence of the name. Right? Okay, so it is in this double sense of form and language, creative language versus the death-like fixity of language, that I want to think about form as occupying both these possibilities. Form can, on the one hand, play the role of this sort of order-producing, rule-governed fixity, and on the other hand, form can also be a principle of a creative and animating spirit, which moves us, and the pleasures of the text that we experience are on account of this sort of capacity of the form to move. And move here includes the affective idea of being moved by a text. The fact that we are moved by a text suggests that there are things in form that are not, strictly speaking, reducible to a mere set of rules. But I want to carry over this entire discussion on form as governed by a kind of dialectic between stasis and movement, into two notions of formalism. So the discussion on formalism that we began earlier, I want to kind of carry that forward now to make a set of claims about where new formalism kind of pitches itself in this debate about form as in the way I've described it. Now, one reading of new criticism, and this is an important admission to make, according to one view, new criticism has tended to read texts very closely, but under the aegis or under the larger purpose of showing how all the discordant elements within the text are ultimately resolved into an organic whole. this may be true of a number of new critical essays, and certainly one can think of many essays, including those by the well-known critics like Ransom and Wimsatt and maybe some essays of Cleon Brooks, where you see this sort of thing happening, where the pleasures of interpreting a text is to see how all these irresolvable tensions, all the paradoxes, the ironies, the semantic dissonances are at some level shown to orchestrate themselves into a kind of harmony. There's a harmonizing potential that good literature offers. And according to one reading of New Criticism, the job of critic is to show how this process of harmonizing is possible. So if you accept this sort of perhaps uncharitable reading of New Criticism, you would understand why it became possible for a whole generation of critics to therefore be suspicious of the idea of form. A lot of critics, especially those who came into prominence in the 70s and 80s with the advent of literary theory, tended to find form a fairly suspicious thing. They saw in form a certain kind of mystification, an ideological mystification, because according to them, to think of form is to think about how historical contradictions, real historical contradictions, are kind of transmuted into resolvable form at the level of a kind of totality. That the text is able to artificially produce a certain kind of harmony, which is always done through the erasure of these real historical contradictions. So form was seen as an important ideological mystification, which for people like Jerome McGann, is a very well-known romantic critic who wrote a book called The Romantic Ideology, or critics like even critics like Frederick Jameson argued that it is important to show how a number of literary texts use form to provide imaginary resolutions to real social contradictions. Terry Eagleton, in an early book called Criticism and Ideology, also made a similar argument by pointing out how in Shakespeare there are instances of how this idea of a formal unity subsumes all the discordant elements within it. Right? So for this generation of critics, it is important to expose the dangers of this sort of ideological function of form, and they were therefore more interested in showing how the text is in some ways always capable of showing us real ideological fault lines that need to be drawn out of the text and not covered up under some spurious idea of formal unity. Right? Now, this is again, like I said, a very debatable account of New Criticism because there are a number of recent critics, including Marjorie Levinson, who are arguing that this is a flattening or a caricature of New Criticism, because at no point was New Criticism guilty of this sort of simplistic or ignorant understanding of form, because they were aware of history and of the tensions within historical matrices that texts came out of, and so at no point were they as blithely ignorant of this mystification of form as perhaps these critics are pointing out. But anyway, that's a debate we can perhaps get into later on. But I'm just going to now take this debate, this argument one step further to show that perhaps this reading of form, which sees it as a form of ideological mystification that tends to produce artificial harmonies and create a certain sense of a kind of organic whole at the expense of real social tensions, by saying that perhaps this is a limited reading of form, because a number of new formalists have shown that close textual analysis reveals a somewhat different story. New Formalism has shown how a number of canonical texts across literary periods that in such texts they have shown that there is this harmonizing tendency, or this tendency to unify a form into some sort of an artificial whole, or organic whole, is always in tension with another energy within these same texts, which is one that tends to disrupt, dissolve, and interrupt such unities. So, in other words, what these new formalist critics like Marjorie Levinson are trying to argue is that these very same texts that Jameson and Eagleton refer to as bound by a certain artificial notion of harmony are, on closer inspection, seen to have a number of elements that do not get processed into the idea of unity. That there are a number of elements within these texts that call into question the very idea of such a unity. Right? So, my point is that it is the extent of your textual analysis that takes you beyond this sort of idea of form into a more supple and less sort of contained idea of form. Because according to these new formalist critics, it is equally possible to see in a number of texts a messy, disruptive, a kind of constantly dissolving margins of what we call unity. That there are too many discordant elements that don't get synthesized or processed into some notion of unity. These critics do not see form as an inherently totalizing thing, but see it instead as having the resources to complicate and subvert dominant ideology. At the very least, they treat form not as a finished or mystified notion of completion, because for them, the idea of form is better served by thinking of it not as an adequation between text and world, or between form and content, not as like a synchrony between form and content, but as perpetually prone to non-adequation, or to what Susan Wolfson calls a constant slippage, erasure, non-coincidence, and remainder. That there is a tendency within all of these texts to not quite resolve the tension between form and content. Barthes's famous comment is appropriate at this point. In a book called Myth Today, he wrote, and I quote, "A little formalism turns us away from history, but a lot of formalism brings us back to it, and is therefore a confirmation of Lukács's theory of literary form, because for Lukács, the truly social element in literature is form. Form is what allows you to understand how social tensions acquire intelligible form in literary expression." And more recently, W.J.T. Michel, in a 2003 essay called "The Commitment to Form," he writes, and I quote, "A commitment to form is also finally a commitment to an emancipatory progressive politics, and includes practices that are united with a scrupulous attention to ethical means." So for Michel, for W.J.T. Michel, we are doing ourselves a great disservice if we turn away from form, because it is by a more rigorous commitment to form that we actually manage to evolve a more meaningful political engagement with texts. Right? But why ethical, and why does he mention this idea of means? And I'm going to end by just saying a few more lines about what the ethical means here. Literature operates on a principle that assumes an isomorphism between form and content. That is, there's some sort of a mapping for one onto the other. It sees the two as mapped onto each other in a fundamental sense. This is similar to a means versus ends structure. And a means versus end structure also assumes that how one goes about something is fundamentally connected to what one achieves at the end of that journey. So means and end therefore have to be in conversation with each other and have to be mutually reinforcing. How one speaks is correlatable to what one says, but to break this relationship and to pretend that how something is said is not valid or not important in understanding what it is saying, I feel that sort of a rupture between the how and what of literature has serious consequences, because it reduces the world to either a free fall into meaningless forms, like a postmodern kitsch where nothing has value, or it reduces the world into a pure content without forms, which is another name for a totalitarian society where there is no recognition of form at all. I'll stop here. I have plenty more to say, but maybe I'm not sure if I've already overshot my time. But Shafi, I'm kind of done.
Thank you, Jacob, for that insightful and illuminating lecture on new formalism. I must say, it has raised so many questions that I don't think that we would be able to touch even some of them in the discussion that is going to take place now. I mean, I was especially intrigued with the last part where you ended, where you talked about W.J.T. Mitchell's understanding of devotion or an attention to form as being an ethical exercise, and that immediately brought to my mind what we are seeing today, that things that are said and which we think have a certain meaning can later be changed, retrospectively, um, in a way where it almost seems as if the form has no relationship to the content, and so therefore that is what came to my mind, that if we in fact if this is what W.J.T. Mitchell actually meant, that if we
Absolutely,
devote,
that's exactly you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly
that if
what
we,
you.
that is, yes, that a form is supposed to have a certain content, and we cannot disregard what, for example, if I say something, I cannot retrospectively disregard what those words were supposed to mean and say that it means something else altogether. And that is something that we are seeing a lot of today. And similarly, there's a lot of questions that were coming to my mind as you spoke. And I thank you for this, for refreshing my memory, and I'm sure of many of my colleagues and participants, of the theory that we had learned, and perhaps we have now forgotten a bit. New criticism, I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, formalism, and so on. But I can see that there are many questions that we are getting in the live comments, and therefore, without further ado, I'd like to move on to that. So there's the first question on the screen. This is Pradeep Dhillon. Should I read it out?
No, I can see it.
Sure, sure.
So will all the participants be able to see the question? Should I read out the question, or will other participants be able to see it?
I think other participants would also be able to see the question. So because this entire thing will be like, so you can just answer the question.
Okay, so I think the question speaks to a certain anxiety that new formalism might be unable to deal with the question of those voices that are silent in a literary text, and or those voices that don't make it to the space of the literary, and will new formalism be able to envoice these voiceless subjects? I suppose one way of thinking about it's a great question. Thank you so much, Pradeep. I think one way of thinking about an answer to this would be to suggest that new formalism is only arguing that a mere kind of insistence that the voiceless should find voice which comes at the cost of actually engaging with the text, becomes a certain kind of assertion that lacks the coherence that will come if you are able to show how the text is both silencing or peripheralizing certain voices. Okay? So let me try and say that a little more in a more straightforward manner. I think what I'm trying to say is that new formalism would certainly not think of the voiceless as something that cannot be recuperated through a new formalist reading, but it would insist that voice that is silent in the text must be seen in relation to the dynamics of the text itself. That it is only when you place that voice on the stage along with a whole set of other textual components that the silencing or otherwise of that voice makes sense. Otherwise, it becomes a mere assertion of a certain identity which you are kind of bringing to the text regardless of the text. I think it is more meaningful, according to new formalism, to show the textual mechanisms whereby the silencing is happening, to show how it is through particular textual processes that certain voices get written out of the script of the text. But to bypass that is to merely make the kind of somewhat empty assertion that other voices also need to be brought in. But that assertion is an important assertion. I'm not saying that it's invalid, but I think that assertion needs to be articulated through a textual engagement rather than in isolation of it. Yeah.
Can we have the next question?
That's a great question. How can new formalism focus on extreme moments? Right? Yeah, so so long as you're working with the idea of a text that is not operating through any notion of a dominant structure, and in fact, there's a lovely discussion of the distinction between form and structure in W.J.T. Mitchell, but I won't go into that. But so long as you're not thinking about structure as this sort of a dominant template through which the text makes sense, and you're able to read the text as full of certain aporias, certain silences, certain interruptions, which show you the limits of what can be represented. And so in other words, so long as you're looking at form as able to show up its own limits, I think it is entirely possible to see text as representing that which is difficult to put in words. Right? So very often trauma and subjects like abuse and mental illness and so on lack a vocabulary for representing themselves. And so if one is working with a like I said, a more sophisticated notion of form, one can identify such moments where the form itself undergoes a certain break or a kind of rupture. And we know that these are moments which speak to such unrepresentable moments. So like to take the well-known example of Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Part of what Spivak is offering us as a reading is exactly the unspeakable, unrepresentable nature of that suicide at the end of her essay. Now, it is the job of a good literary text and a good literary critical endeavor to be attentive to such moments of silence, of unrepresentability. And if you look at romantic poetry, which happens to be my area of interest, you'll find that romantic poetry is entirely organized around moments of breakdown, moments where meaning is interrupted, is disrupted, where there is a kind of interruption of the narrator himself, and something happens to the narrator which is unforeseen by the narrator, outside his voluntary control. Right? And so in romantic poetry, in Wordsworth's poetry, for instance, you find a number of instances of this sort of rupture, where things happen which are not part of narrative and volitional control of the narrator. And it is in these moments of rupture that you can hear the voice of such experiences of trauma. If I'm getting the question right. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Yeah, that's again. Thank you so much for this question. Ekphrasis is a subject I'm deeply interested in, and so ekphrasis, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, is basically a text which focuses on a visual text, like a painting or a sculpture. And so Keats's Grecian Urn or even Browning's My Last Duchess are good examples of this sort of ekphrastic text. The question is, isn't every text ekphrastic, in that it gives a vivid visual and a description of what makes or happens in a society? So are not all texts pictures of the world? I think that's one way of phrasing this question. Is not every text a certain kind of visual picture? Yes and no, and I think there is a very valid sense in which texts offer us a certain pictorial view of the world. But the problem in all literary art, as opposed to the plastic arts, that is painting and sculpture, in all the literary arts, language plays an important role that prevents a kind of ekphrastic stillness. So ekphrasis assumes a certain kind of stillness, a certain kind of silence that is already embodied within the work of art. In literary art, on the contrary, there is a certain temporality built into language. Language is an art of time. It unfolds over time. And so, since there is a narrative and temporal element in language, it sometimes becomes very difficult to see it as an ekphrastic image, because things happen over time in a novel or a poem and so on. And it is in the unfolding that we make sense of the poem or the novel, not in its instantaneous apprehension. To look at a painting is to see it as an object that we see at one moment. But to read a poem is to read one word after the other. In that sense, it is not ekphrastic. But I think your question is a great question, because there's a critic called Garrett Stewart who's been arguing for a while now, that he says in all narrative literature, including novels and poems, he says there is a what he calls stasis envy, which is a kind of longing for equilibrium, longing for a kind of permanence. And he says that different, especially in poetry, you find different devices that are used to try and achieve this sort of equilibrium. Either a kind of circular model of narrative where things come back to the beginning, or a constant attempt to identify with visual arts. So in all these cases, the poem is seen to yearn for this sort of ekphrastic status, which often it finds it impossible to do, because the medium of language is fundamentally antithetical to ekphrastic stasis. So it's always a tension for W.J.T. Mitchell, who's got an entire set of essays on ekphrasis, says that ekphrasis, or the desire for stasis, is the black hole, he calls it, of all of a number of poems that are trying to do what is impossible to do, because the medium does not allow them to do that. But anyway, that's a sorry for a longish answer to a but it's a great question. Thank you so much.
I think that would be the last question.
Okay.
I am sure we would all like to continue, but we are short of time. So I would like to invite Professor Rimpi Sarkar to give the formal vote of thanks. to both our speakers.
Thank you very much, sir, for inviting me to deliver this session's vote of thanks. On behalf on all the organizers of this 3-day national web conference on contemporary trends in literature, I take this opportunity to sincerely thank and acknowledge the support and guidance of our Honorable Vice Chancellor and Chief Patron, Professor Ranjit Kumar Verma, Pro Vice Chancellor and Patron, Professor Kusum Kumari, Revered Registrar and Advisor, Colonel Vijay Kumar Thakur, esteemed convener of this conference, Dr. Bhavesh Chandra Pandey, all the teachers of the English Department of Munger University, today's session moderator, Mohammad Safed Danish, and especially Mr. Abhishek Kumar and his Spark Digital Technologies for the technical assistance extended, which has been of immense help. Overall, it has been collective effort to utilize this virtual platform for an academic cause. I am even more thankful to the two renowned speakers of this session, Professor Madhusmita Pati, Professor Department of English, Ramadevi Women's University, Bhubaneswar, and Dr. N. Jacob, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Ramjas College, University of Delhi, for taking time out of their busy schedules and kindly consenting to grace this conference with their engaging, enlightening and engrossing lectures on Dalitism and gender and new formalism respectively. I sincerely apologize to Professor Madhusmita ma'am for the inconvenience caused due to technological failure, because of which our moderator couldn't thank her enough for her extremely engaging lecture and wonderful presentation. I hope she will forgive us for this unintentional hitch and continue to shower her blessings upon us. Thank you very much, ma'am, once again. And now finally, I express my gratitude to all the attendees without whose support and involvement, this conference would have turned meaningless. Thank you very much for sparing your valuable time and virtually staying with us throughout. I hope this session has been both benefiting and enjoyable to one and all. So that's it. Have a fruitful evening. Thank you, everyone.
Do join us tomorrow at 11 o'clock for the fifth session.
Thank you, Rulfi. Thank you, Anindya, for all the help. And thank you very much, Shafi. It's nice to meet you, even if it's only virtually.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, ma'am. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, and goodbye. Bye. Please take care. And join us tomorrow at 11 o'clock for the fifth session of this seminar. Goodbye and take care.